Welcome to another edition of Polar Insight Conversations, where we speak with leading thinkers and practitioners to explore one simple question. How can we help leadership teams make decisions they can stand behind? Each conversation looks beyond the headlines and conventional wisdom about decision making to uncover practical ideas that can help leaders navigate complexity, uncertainty, and accountability with greater confidence. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Polly Mackenzie. Polly has worked at the heart of government, public policy, institutional reform and innovation, including as Director of Policy to the Deputy Prime Minister and Chief Executive of the think tank Demos. She's now co-founder and CEO of Zinc Innovation Partners. Her career offers valuable insight into how consequential decisions are really made, why good evidence and promising ideas often struggle to change established systems, and what institutions need to do in order to learn, adapt, and act. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and let's jump into it. Polly, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
I want to dive into an area now, thinking about consequential decisions as it relates to your various roles, your various diversity of experiences that you've had in your career so far. Could you talk to me a little bit about what those roles have taught you about consequential decision making and how those decisions get made?
Yeah, so I guess what makes me a bit unusual is the number of different jobs I've had in different sectors. You know, I started out as a journalist, but, business journalist working in the private sector, went into politics, but then into government, which is not the same, set up a political party, set up a charity, worked in a university, and now I'm back working in the private sector. And I guess one of the things that fascinates me is that sectors and then organizations within sectors, which is often talked about, but sectors really do have like just their own sort of ways of thinking, their own processes, often which aren't articulated or written down at all. And I think it's one of the reasons why, so many good things would happen in the world if different organizations could collaborate. If the government could work with the private sector and the charities. And often they can't because of this question around decision making, is that just the ways that decisions are understood and made and crystallized is so different in different organizations. Universities, for example, it's often said that academics in a university say they work at a university, and the administrative staff are more likely to say they work for the university. But that's quite an important distinction, because especially research academics are responsible for bringing in their own research funding, doing their own work, and so what you've got is a community of quasi-autonomous professionals. And even when they're doing teaching in a more kind of conventional path, that's still how the academic is, I think, largely rightly conceives of themselves. And so there's almost no strategic decision-making capability within a university. I've heard them described as decerebrated cats in the past by management theories, which is a cat that's had the cerebellum cut off from its brain. So and you then try and get a university to collaborate with the government or with charities, and it becomes really, really difficult. And that's something that really troubles me in a way. Decisions are, I guess, the other thing that's most important, probably from my multifaceted career, is it's usually much, much more chaotic than you would like to think. It's very often you discover that people think somebody else is in charge, but they don't quite know who. And so, decisions, even quite significant ones, often get just sort of lost. And it's almost impossible to say really who made the decision and when.
And do you see that in some sectors more than other sectors, or is that to do with, do you see that as something as it relates to the size of the organization and how many people are operating on it? Is it the structure of those organizations? How do you who does it well and who does it less well? You mentioned universities as potentially one of those spaces where they're doing it slightly better.
I mean, no, but are they? But again, it depends. I mean, what are you trying to achieve? I mean, it is an organization achieving its goals is what matters, and having highly autonomous individuals pursuing their own initiatives might be a really good thing if what you're trying to do is pursue, the boundaries of academic knowledge. If what you're trying to run is fire safety protocols in a school, not so much, right? And so I think it's therefore really important for organization to think about, like, what are the decision-making frames that might be appropriate for them and their context. I mean, politics is obviously where I spent like the kind of foundational years of my life. And I think but conspiracy theories never really understand is how kind of deeply chaotic the political decision-making process is, partly because it's so based on personal relationships, a very, very fast-paced decision-making cycle, and a huge amount of informality, which I think has only increased over the course of my career, the last 20 or 30 years, because of new forms of communication. Which means the ability to even like crystallize and hold a decision that can be strategic in its intent, can last for 3 to 5 years, has become, I think, much harder.
And in your experience, is that an individual skill that some people have that they're very good at, in that they can keep, let's say, I mean, a very topical example at the moment would be communication styles of the current Prime Minister versus the last Prime Minister, and the ability for that communication style to be able to kind of bring people along for a period of time, or kind of get them on side, maybe in a slightly different way to previous. Do you think it I suppose things like those structures you've mentioned, is that based on the individual personalities within those particular contexts, or do you think that's about policy making, government, institutions in general, where they've just become a bit more informal, they've become faster moving, etc., etc.?
I think that's it. It's definitely a sort of a massive trend. When I went into government with the coalition, working with Nick Clegg, there was this sort of sigh of relief from the civil service, because the fact of having two parties working together meant that a lot more stuff needed to be formally negotiated and written down. And we had, for those 5 years, what was called the Quad, which was essentially a sort of a mini cabinet, really, of the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And everything that was difficult, really, for the whole government got, in the end, kind of just drawn into, if it couldn't be resolved, the four of them would resolve it. And that clarity was a huge change from the previous, what Tony Blair had run, which people had called kind of sofa government, of doing things outside of formal and minuted meetings. But I think the reality was those 5 years were a complete anomaly in the wider trend, which is towards people being able to communicate so instantaneously and so constantly. And you've seen that through the COVID inquiry process, where endless amounts of kind of WhatsApp messages and emails and IMs have been shared, and to understand that really what happens in meetings is not where the governing is happening. And I think that is true across lots and lots of organizations, right? It's not just a government thing. Is you can have big formal executive committee type meetings, but once you've got a certain number of very senior people around the table, they often, rightly, but just don't have the visibility of what's happening on the ground within the 100, 200, 500 people who are reporting to them. And so in the end, you have to have pre-cooked everything. And that means that a lot of meetings for a lot of organizations are really just sort of organizational theatre in order to confirm things. And I think uh, working out how to actually use meetings effectively to become real places of challenge and decision making is really difficult, because often, a board meeting is so high stakes, certainly in the private sector, that actually allowing dissent to happen in the board becomes the sort of thing that a chair considers to be a risk.
And are there examples you've come across, or organizations you've come across, or settings you've come across where they are able to break that, organizational theatre or kind of meeting theatre construct and get down to maybe a more representative view of what they're making a decision on? Are there particular methods for doing that better? Are there particular things which seem to lead to perhaps more effective conversations, effective strategic decision making, etc., etc.?
Well, I really like thinking about the design diamond, or the double diamond, depending on how much you like it. And people don't know. The idea is you've got essentially a process where you go outwards to discover what the problem is, and then what the problems might be, and then back in again to identify what the key problem you're trying to solve is, that you then go back out to explore potential solutions and hone in on an individual solution to your problem. I think what lots of organizations struggle with is working out where they are in that process. And so, you'll sometimes see, say, a paper come to a board, and people are like, why are we even talking about this? Is this a real problem? Kind of unpicking the fundamentals. Or why haven't you considered this idea, when what the people bringing that paper were hoping for was just to have the whole thing rubber stamped? And actually making sure that you are bringing whatever team it is, however senior it is, bringing people along with that process, and then reminding people of where you actually are in that process, what the previous discussions and decisions were. I think is the thing I've seen be absolutely critical for enabling people to actually provide comments and feel that they are going along, especially when those decisions are going to be controversial within an organization, with the public, or whatever that might be. But much more important than that really is trust and relationships between the principals. I think a lot of money probably gets wasted on slightly ineffective team coaching and team counseling. But, an organization needs to know what it's for. People need to be able to disagree and then move on. I think I've worked in a lot of places where, and it's particularly because politics is the worst for this, because people could carry resentment about what happened 20 years ago, and factionalism and tribalism are sort of baked into the way people think and operate. But you see those behaviors in lots and lots of organizations. I could give an example of working on a massive kind of operational sustainability plan, and the sort of energy manager really wanted some new software, because we really needed some new software. But at one point he just sort of slightly lost his temper with me and said, I just need to get the software that works for me and my team. I'm like, you don't actually. The reason the IT department are being a bit difficult is because what you need us to have is software that works for the whole organization. And endless organizations whose fundamental digital problem is that everybody's bought an individual website or an individual piece of software, and none of these things are capable of talking to each other. And actually collaboration is more important than getting precisely the thing that you need. And lots of people really struggle with that, right? And so they just sort of hunker down and try and stay away from the bureaucracy and its flaws, which I have emotional sympathy for, but doesn't really get you anywhere.
I think also on that point, I think it's that idea of often people retreating from the areas of discussion and the problems that will, if solved, knock down a lot of the other kind of smaller problems. So things like you mentioned earlier about the intent that people have, and making sure that there's alignment around a particular narrative, let's say. actually that is far, far, far more impactful, getting everyone on board for the future of that organization, or the future of all of the decisions which then come after it. But because it's hard, people often go into these other spaces, as you say. They go into different parts of the process, or it's hard gathering various stakeholders and kind of aligning them around this. And therefore they say, okay, well, I'm gonna go back to first principles and question some of the fundamentals, almost because it's a kind of a quicker, it's a kind of get out clause essentially for not necessarily spending the time on that alignment piece, which is hard work, but if done is much more consequential sometimes than some of the other smaller questions that surround it. Do you how do you think people are thinking about we've spoken in the past about this idea of focusing on the kind of the right hand side of things rather than the left hand side of things. What is it about that? And perhaps you could explain that for the audience in a bit more detail. But what is it that people keep on getting wrong about that?
Well, so, and obviously this is a Western way of thinking about which order arrows naturally go. If you're a Hebrew or a Japanese speaker, then you probably, what I mean is start from the left. But if you draw a sort of systems map, you tend to start from the left, say this thing happens, and then that little arrow, then this thing happens, and this thing happens. And in both research impact, in campaigning, charity work, we often think about a theory of change. The things that you do, the impacts that you're having, and why that makes the world better. But when it comes to designing what to do, the most important thing is to start with the problem that you're trying to solve and work backwards from that. And that's really, really difficult for organizations for two reasons. One is, for every individual, for every team, for every department, what's much, much easier to do is just carry on doing the thing that you are doing. And what's the next right thing to do? And I should do that. And if you instead go, well, I know, here's an example. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, amazing charity. They do incredible work. They've been around for, 150 years or so, and their objective is to abolish poverty, and it's not exactly going very well. And that's not, I'm not trying to be too snarky about it, but actually, if you think about, okay, what we're here for is to abolish poverty. Are we doing the right things in order to have, not to definitely fix the problem, but to give the best chance, given who we are and what our capabilities and resources are, of doing that? When you start from the right and you start with the problem, it forces you to rethink the habits and procedures and behaviors of what it is that you do. And that's really tricky. One of the reasons it's tricky is because if your job is to answer the phone, it's quite easy to count how many phone calls you've done. If you are answering the phone for a debt advice helpline, measuring whether you've spoken to people is easy. Measuring whether they actually got out of debt is harder, right? And so much of what we're trying to do, especially in kind of charity and social impact, is change things that are difficult to measure. It's so much easier in the private sector, where probably with your shareholders are trying to optimize the revenue and profitability of your business. Sometimes maybe you're trying to maximize the share price. Sometimes you're thinking, about maximizing the sale price and the capital value. But fundamentally, you're optimizing for money. In the social sector, you're optimizing for something else that you probably can't count. And that, again, forces us to think really, really deeply about how we learn and how we change. The thing that I guess frustrates me is how few organizations are really willing to push themselves into addressing the fundamentals of whether they are set up right to do the things that they want to do.
It sounds like in what you're saying there that one of the things that is helping in these spaces where it's hard to measure is systems. So by putting in, either kind of a system to design in a particular way, or a process to make decisions when the things you're making decisions about are a bit more qualitative or a bit harder to manage. If you think about it from the opposite perspective to that, so if we thought about in a context which is a bit more fixed, system based, as you say, within the financial services space, you could argue that it is, given the nature of the work, it is quite quantitative. There are lots of fixed systems. What do you think within that context people should be taking from some of these other areas of, whether it is design, campaigning, the third sector, the civil society sector, politics, that may provide them with a different point of view for how they might typically approach a problem or a decision within their organization? What do you think they do well, those sectors?
Well, I think everyone can do better, can't they? So I was just talking to somebody this morning about financial innovation, actually, and she gave me great joy because she used the word socio-technical, which is a word that I like to use as well, which is trying to recognize that, like, getting the tech stack right to change, in her case, the payment system, or whichever piece of your financial services that you're trying to design. In a way, that's the easy bit, but it gets all of the attention. And that actually, at the end of all of this technology are people, are humans. And so the other person I've heard talk about this is a guy called Kevin Fong, who is the clinical director at UCL Health Partners. And he talks about the NHS, which spends half of its money on technical stuff, and half its money on people. And yet when we talk about health innovation, mostly we are talking about, like, oh yeah, let's have a new widget, let's have a new drug. And widgets and drugs can save lives, transform lives. They're massively important, but they're not getting the attention. They're getting the attention that some of which needs to go to the other 50% of the spend, partly because the widgets and the drugs don't make it to people, or they make it to people and they get, like, left on the sofa and not used. If we don't recognize that actually when it comes to adoption and change, it's all about diffusion, about humans, about relationship, about feelings. We absolutely see this in, the payments world, right? Where obviously we've seen this unbelievable sort of digital transformation away from cash. And then the kind of the social financial inclusion sector is a bit like, hello, have you noticed that there are all of these people for whom cash is a massive default, a strong preference? They may be older, they may have learning disabilities, and actually the ability to adopt alternative financial products might be constrained. And they might actually use cash for budgeting purposes. When I was working at Money and Mental Health, we found loads of people for whom actually being able to hold on to the thing, its physicality, was really helped them keep their budget in control. Whereas the sort of very low friction swipe was really, really difficult. Now, it seems to me, if you're thinking about the system as a whole, which the FCA is, supposedly, or the government should be, what you need is, instead of just putting these two bits in conflict with each other, right? Like the tech bros who, like, I've invented something that's better than cash, and a group of people saying, but actually it's not better than cash for us, is you actually need to bring those together and say, well, what would it take to find financial products and services that actually meet the needs of this customer group, who are also humans, also important, and also worth listening to? And one of the challenges is, especially if you're building in the private sector, is that, of course, you go after the easiest to get customers. Of course you do. And the fact that you might be leaving 20% of people behind is like, sort of not really your problem unless the government regulates to make it your problem. So we end up with conflict instead of people trying to actually design for the real humans who exist in the system. And that's, you know, where I'm increasingly focusing my attention is how do we build the products, the services that the world needs, that our citizens need, rather than just the ones that the market wants. The ones that the market wants, they're going to kind of happen on their own. I'm not too worried about it, but there is this big gap, and we're too used to just kind of fighting to keep the status quo, keep the dregs of the status quo, instead of actually building for inclusion.
And do you think on that last point, there's something to, as you say, there's a difference between building for what the market wants and for that demand versus potentially what that market might need. And it's the difference between those two things. So the market may want, you know, X, Y, and Z, but then if you have various groups left out of that process who can't gain access to that product, or for whom that product is not necessarily designed for or built for, it's almost trying to identify some of those things where there is a clear demand. It might just be that those products are framed in the wrong way, marketed in the wrong way, supplied to the market in the wrong way to some extent. Would that be accurate?
Completely. And it's where Fair by Design have done some really good work trying to both encourage mainstream products and services to change, but also to support and enable alternatives to be built. Because, you know, it's not just as simple as you get a bit less money if you are building for a small market than if you're building for a big market. It's the way risk capital is allocated is that basically you can either get lots of money or none at all. And we see this in kind of university spin-outs as well. Like if you've got an invention that's suitable for venture capital, then you can probably get it backed. And if you've got an invention that might, you know, solve a real problem, make £10 million, hire a few hundred people, nah, nobody's going to back that. So it just gets stuck inside the university. And again, there are loads of people trying to build in financially inclusive products. That's where Fair by Design, you know, created an investment fund that's not looking for the same returns that conventional capital would be, so that it can support people to actually make it to these markets, which, you know, often which are large markets, people with learning disabilities, right? Who, again, often need the support of a carer or a loved one to help them manage their finances, often are using products that were designed for children. And sometimes that's fine, but actually it might not be appropriate for an adult with learning disabilities or neurodivergence, and actually that's not 40 people, right? That's not niche. It's just, it's not big enough to be worth the attention of the people who want to, you know, in the end, build the next unicorn.
One thing which strikes me as we're speaking about is that there are certain skills, ways of working, ways of operating within the policy-making sphere, within politics, within government, from the perspective of convening people together to make decisions. If you then look at that in the context of what you were talking about a minute ago, when you were saying about bringing people together to say, what would it take to make this work? So these two audiences want two different things from this product. How do we kind of facilitate that conversation? It strikes me that there are lots of skills that you can take from one arena, bring into the innovation space to a lot of, to make a lot of these things happen. Do you think that is something which is happening more than it used to be? Do you think there is, this idea of convening different audiences together and almost to go to what you mentioned there about the size of each one of these markets? Actually, sometimes if you pool all of those audiences together, they may end up being the majority of the market or the majority of the audience. Be great to just hear your perspective on that and your point of view of maybe things that you might have taken from one area of your career and kind of transplanted into what you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the discipline of design that I think draws so many of these threads together. And, often people think of design as, simply like making things look pretty or making physical products. And those things are very important, but actually designing human systems and designing innovations is absolutely a part of the kind of the intellectual discipline of design theory and design practice. And I guess, so I would love to see design used more as a way of engaging with problems. And I would contrast that with analysis. Not that analysis is wrong, and in fact, understanding a problem is a critical part of the design process that we've talked about. But if what is the dominant profession of policymaking in the UK? It's economists, right? Like it's people who, it's policy, politics, and economics as our sort of way of thinking about like what, and of course the economist mindset is, again, I'm not against economists. I don't think they're evil, but like it's an analytical frame, wanting to understand, whereas design is an activist frame. It's interventionist, and it places analysis where it belongs as part of a process towards solutions. And I find myself often getting cross with, like journalistic content or a certain kind of politician who's just always about, like, I'm cleverer than you because I've understood the problem. Well, maybe you have, but like, what are you going to do about it? And it's the people who are willing to, get into the arena and actually fix things that excite me. And design, which is that interventionist mindset, but, disciplined and processed towards solutions that excites me. And I think we absolutely are seeing it used more and more, particularly in policymaking. 10 years ago or so, Jeremy Hayward set up something called Policy Lab, which was designed to be a unit to pioneer novel ways of doing policy. And what's great about Policy Lab is they're always sort of 3 steps ahead of everybody else. So stuff they were doing 10 years ago is actually pretty normal. It happens all over the civil service, but so they've just moved on, and they are absolutely central to this spreading of design thinking in government policymaking. Another thing that, again, fits in the start from the right mindset is the kind of increasing use of outcome-based contracts for securing government objectives. Instead of trying to just buy activity, which might or might not work, is to actually specify the outcome that you want and leave flexibility for innovation in the processes. Because, one of the stupid things about the way government contracts tend to work is they tend to be quite, really kind of big and chunky and fixed, and they specify all the things you need to do. And actually, a year, 2 years, 3 years in, you then got to get a big contract revision in order to say, actually, this isn't working. If we did it this way, it would be better. And if you haven't built space for innovation, then you are going to end up, wasting money, wasting resources. Outcome-based contracts are much cleverer than that. They say, this is what we want you to achieve, and do it how you like. Treasury get a bit worried about it because they're a bit scared that people might find a really cheap way to deliver the outcome and make a super profit. But for me, that's a good thing, because somebody's discovered a new thing, which is a really cheap way to achieve a social objective. And in the years to come, we can just diffuse that way of doing things and not worry about it too much. So I'm really glad to see the growth of those kinds of innovations, which again often require different sectors to collaborate. We started out by talking about how difficult it is for different sectors to collaborate, but I think it's being just about better understood and better put into practice, particularly because of increasing wave of devolution from government, which again just makes it much, much easier for different organisations to collaborate around a single problem in a single place.
Do you think that idea of encouraging collaboration and it's interesting that we end up on that point of, thinking about how you adjust contract terms to enable the best possible outcomes for work that you're doing within that context. And actually, there's something to be said there for, how can you bring basically that someone who may have a more traditional kind of design mindset or design approach with someone who's bringing more of a kind of legalistic lawyer, potentially more fixed approach to it. And it's the combination of the two that lead to that moment of innovation or leads to making a change that has, a meaningful impact. To be able to bring those people together and to be able to convene those types of conversations requires a certain type of person, requires a certain type of approach from an individual point of view. And let's say you're a decision maker within a large enterprise, within a large organization. What types of skills do you think you should be looking to work on as an individual to be able to bring that lawyer together with that designer, to bring an economist together with a campaigner, or
that's such a good question. And I think a part of this again is about the process for how you get people to collaborate, whether it's within an organization or a multi-sector thing, is again thinking about when you bring people in. I think very often we do things in a sort of linear way, where you get, you get your frontline housing worker to invent a new idea, and then everyone gets very excited about it, and then you take it to the lawyer, and the lawyer's like, no, that's illegal. Or then you take it to the comms people, and they're like, no, I'm sorry, that's a terrible idea because, well, some people will start a petition against us. Well, actually, what you want to do is bring those people who conventionally sit at the end of a process and bring them into a kind of collaborative design at the beginning, so that you've got people actually bought into designing around problems from the earlier stages. In terms of the skills, though, I think it's a mistake that we make culturally, is because we think of careers as relatively linear. What you're looking for in a lawyer, until you get to the most very senior levels where you're really just looking for a senior executive, but we're valuing a kind of skills within that vertical that ladder you up to your career and your seniority, and the same with all of these other professions. And very often people get very limited exposure to other teams, or if they do, it's in an adversarial context, right? The lawyers are trying to stop the journalists from doing something, or the procurement people are trying to stop somebody from buying something they need, or and so that's really challenging. And you then see that if people go out of one context into a different kind of impact space, they really struggle to thrive, which means that, again, most people just continue to pursue very linear careers, where they start in a university at 25 and they're still there at 55, or they start in a local authority and that's really all they know, etc., etc. One of the things that we do at Zinc is we do fellowships, which are kind of 6-month career placements, taking people who are interested in changing and learning about how to have impact in a different sector. So we've mostly worked with academics, not exclusively, but either academics who are wanting to go into commercializing their research. Again, just the way that a commercial organization thinks about measurement and success and value are so different from a university sector. So we put them into a startup business, total immersion, lots and lots of support, so that they land well. It helps to accelerate the venture, but also just changes the way they think about themselves and their career. We're doing something similar, supporting a group of academics who've been put into secondments into the civil service. Again, totally different, again, from a startup. You could do the same thing, putting startup people into the civil service, or putting civil servants into universities, all of this. I really think we should do more of that. Like, I'm so much more interested in hiring people who, they have their core professional skill set, right? Their qualifications or their capabilities, but they're also interested in other things. And so people who've done 3 months, 6 months, or who actually spent a year working in a charity, or even if it's through volunteering, have just exposed themselves to other people's operating models and approaches to the world.
I think it's a fascinating way of thinking about it, and I think certainly some of the we've been speaking on this series to a lot of behavioral scientists and psychologists and people who think very deeply about perception, I suppose, is probably the best way of framing it. And I think that ability to think, how can I change my understanding of another context that's different to mine? First and foremost, just get your body into that context and get your your kind of physical presence into that space. Because obviously, by actually being there and absorbing, what's going on around you, absorbing the environment, absorbing how people act in that space, there's huge amounts of information there to be gathered before you even start interacting with anyone within that setting and asking them questions. And I think certainly that point we were talking earlier about the design diamond and getting to that point of really understanding the problem. I think before you start asking people questions, there is also just understanding what that feels like to be in that environment. If you're the policy person, go and spend some time with the economist. If you're the economist, go and spend some time with a social worker. Go and spend some time in a bank, in a energy firm, because these places all have their ways of operating, and it can be very easy and perhaps very tempting to consider that we might know what those spaces feel like, run like, operate like. And to go to your point earlier about kind of government and politics, sometimes it's a lot more chaotic than people would assume, and that is, I would imagine, in the politics space, because they are fantastic on the, generally, with many exceptions, but generally they're very good communicators. They're very good at building narratives and being able to say things operate in this particular way. And I think to be able to get into these spaces, understand them in a bit more detail, and really see what it feels like basically to operate in those spaces, I think can be a huge gain for people, and something which we've seen a lot in the work that we do over the years as well.
If you think of it as there's common sense in every sector, that's just what everyone does. It's quite good. There's also uncommon sense, your kind of the great things you do, which are your competitive advantage. And then you've got your uncommon nonsense and your common nonsense, right? So it's a 4x4 grid, but and so in every sector you've got common nonsense, ways of doing things that everybody does that are stupid. And also then within any organization, there's probably something that's uniquely you that's completely nuts as well, and that you should really stop doing. And one of the things that new people from one of your competitors will help you identify the uncommon nonsense, right? Because they're just bringing good practice from someone else. It's only people from outside of your sector who will help you to identify the common nonsense, because these things just become norms and accepted, and everyone does it that way. And again, that's where the productivity gains can come, is realizing that somebody who comes in with a fresh perspective, and they will probably ask 5 questions, and 3 of the things they pick apart will be like, there's a really good reason why we do it this way. And the other 2 will be like, oh yeah, you're right, we have been wasting a lot of money or doing something stupid or causing harm. And that's why everyone should change career at least as many times as I have.
And on that point, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up, Polly. Thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for joining us. And if there is anyone listening or in the audience who wants to find out a bit more about your work, where would be the best place for them to go? What would be the best way for them to reach you?
You can reach me through LinkedIn. I'm a bit of a LinkedIn addict. Or you can check out the Zinc website, which is zinc.vc.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, Polly.